I booked an Airbnb in Arizona, a quiet place for a job interview I had coming up. The distance from home was too far, so I decided to turn it into a short trip. The specific Airbnb I chose was much cheaper than any of the hotels I could find. It was about a half-hour drive from the interview location, which suited me just fine. The house was tucked away at the end of a secluded dirt road, with a backyard that opened up to a vast desert landscape. Quiet, still, but somehow unsettling. I brought my laptop to keep up with work during the day, filling most of my time while I stayed there. I'd planned a 3-day visit. I arrived on Monday with the interview scheduled for Tuesday, and I planned to leave Friday. That first night, as I sat in the small house's living room reviewing typical interview questions, the clock struck 9. I was buried in last-minute preparation when I heard it, a faint tap on the window. Not a knock, but a soft sound, like someone lightly tapping with their finger. My heart jolted as my head turned instinctively toward the sound. The window was pitch black. Gathering my courage, I stood up and approached the glass, pressing my face to the cold pane. Nothing. Just the vast, dark emptiness of the desert staring back at me. The next day went smoothly. The interview felt like a success, and I spent the remainder of the trip relaxing. I explored the small town, tried a few restaurants, and enjoyed the sun in the backyard. Yet looking back, I wonder if someone was watching me even then. That evening, back inside, I sat on the couch watching Breaking Bad on Netflix when it happened again. A single tap on the window. This time it was clear it wasn't a bug or a mistake. My unease deepened as I rushed to check, but again, there was no one. The desert, as always, remained vast and silent, cloaked in shadows. Determined to uncover the source, I walked through the house, checking the windows and doors. Stepping out onto the back porch, I stood under the pale light spilling from the house, scanning the darkness. Then I heard it, a sharp clicking sound, like someone snapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth. It came from somewhere out there, beyond the bushes in the cold, quiet desert. My skin crawled as I called out into the void. "You're on private property. I'm calling the cops." A second click echoed in response, followed by movement. I squinted, finally spotting a figure in dark clothes standing just far enough away to remain partially hidden. My first instinct was to approach, but halfway there I froze. My gut told me not to get any closer. The figure turned and walked away, melting into the night. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the Airbnb owner. But the thought didn't sit right. The following night, I lay in bed, laptop perched on my lap as I distracted myself with more episodes of Breaking Bad. But when I finally turned out the lights, the silence didn't last long. Within seconds, I heard it again. The unmistakable click. This time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the closet. My heart thundered as I stared at the closet door, which was barely ajar. My survival instincts kicked in. I leapt out of bed, still in my pajamas, and bolted to the car. Sitting in the driveway with the engine running, I dialed 911 and kept my eyes glued to the house. When the police arrived, they conducted a sweep of the small house. There weren't many places to hide, and they found nothing. I didn't care. I packed up my belongings and left that night, checking into a nearby hotel. Later, I contacted both Airbnb and the host. I managed to get a partial refund, but the whole ordeal left a sour taste in my mouth. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that whoever was in that house either had a key or slipped in at just the right time. Some places, I've learned, are better left empty. A small town in Georgia became a symbol of a fresh start for my wife and me. I won't mention the name to avoid any further problems. Our house was on a quiet street with a large yard that bordered a mid-sized patch of woods. This was what had drawn us to it, an ideal place for the kids we planned to have and the dog we were going to adopt. We both worked similar shifts. I usually got home around 5, and my wife, Cheryl, came home around 6. The first 2 days after moving in were completely normal. It was a weekend, and we spent all our time unpacking. But on Monday night, shortly after we turned off the lights and settled into bed, everything changed. At first, we heard it, music tearing through the night silence, loud, old, and distorted, as if it had been recorded on a worn-out vinyl. Our nearest neighbors lived far enough away that it couldn't have been coming from their yards. No, the sound was definitely coming from our backyard. We exchanged frightened glances. I opened the window, and it became even clearer. The music was coming from just behind our house. An old melody from the 1940s, as I later found out, called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf by Henry Hall. Its cheerful rhythm might have brought a smile under normal circumstances, but at that moment, it sounded threatening, eerie, completely out of place in the darkness. We didn't know our new home well yet, but I was certain there had to be a switch for the backyard lights. I ran downstairs and found it near the back door. The floodlights lit up the yard and I stepped outside. The music grew louder, but now I realized its source wasn't the yard. It was the woods. I stood on the cold grass, staring into the dense darkness until the melody ended. Silence returned. Perhaps it was some stupid prank, a greeting for the newcomers? When I went back to Cheryl, I told her it was probably kids trying to scare us. But even as I said it, I realized how absurd it sounded. The next night when we went to bed, it happened again. The music started a few minutes after we turned off the lights. This time, it was even louder, and the melody, far more unnerving. It was Tiptoe Through the Tulips. We exchanged glances again, this time filled with disgust and fear. I went to the window and saw something on the grass. It wasn't a person, but there was definitely something lying there. I'm going to check it out, I said. We need to call the police, Cheryl insisted. I stepped into the yard, the floodlights casting cold light over the grass. Lying there was an old radio. Its melody was haunting, unsettling in its persistence. I bent down to examine it and switched it off. When I returned to the window, I held the radio up to show Cheryl, but her face twisted in terror. She started screaming, "Run! They're behind you!" My heart stopped. I turned and saw three figures emerging from the woods. They stood motionless, like statues, a few meters apart. Their faces were shrouded in shadow, but I knew. They were staring straight at me. I bolted back into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it. Cheryl was already upstairs, her hands trembling as she dialed the police. "They're still out there," she whispered, staring out the window. The police arrived within 10 minutes. During that time, we sat in darkness, too scared to even breathe. Only the sound of their car engine brought a faint sense of relief. We opened the door. Two officers, armed with flashlights and weapons, quickly searched the yard and the edge of the woods. All they found was the old radio, which we handed over to them. "If they come back, call us," one of them said. The next few days were filled with constant fear. At night, I occasionally heard rustling from the woods, but I couldn't see anything. We realized that this house, so appealing at first glance, had brought with it not just dreams of family comfort, but something dark that lurked beyond the edge of our understanding. I worked as a nurse in many hospitals, but this shift was my last. The place was familiar, routine. The geriatric ward, just half an hour's drive from home. Working with elderly patients had never been something new to me, but that night, as you will understand, something happened that I will never forget. It was the night shift, and I was exhausted to the core. I was assigned to the Alzheimer's unit. Their gazes, still and distant, always seemed frozen in another time, but they loved my presence. Youth, movement, my voice, it somehow anchored them to the present moment. Among them was Lena. She was different from the others. When I first entered her room, she immediately started talking about voices. She heard them, and about the man in black who stood in the corner of her room. Her roommate had asked me to close the curtain between the beds before my shift even began. Lena scared her. Yet Lena was friendly, even sweet. Her eyes would light up with warmth when I entered. But those voices and the man in black. That night, most of the patients were asleep by 11, but not Lena. Every time she called me, her face was terrified, her eyes on the brink of panic. She insisted that the voices were getting louder, and the man was getting closer. I tried to calm her down. I held her hand, told her I was there, that she wasn't alone. Eventually, she settled down. When all the patients had finally fallen asleep, the night in the hospital seemed to stretch on like eternity. I went to the storage room to restock my cart with linens. A small room, quiet, the door shut. But suddenly, footsteps. I turned around. No one. Then I felt it. A hand, firm and cold, grabbed my shoulder. I screamed, turned around. Emptiness. No one in the room. My panic increased, but I forced myself to keep working. As soon as I finished, I turned back toward the door, and there he was. The man in black, standing behind the glass of the door, watching me and smiling. My scream woke up the entire ward. When my colleague came to help, I shakily asked if she had seen him, but her answer was simple. Who? We checked all the rooms, all the corridors. No one. Lena woke up, startled by my scream, and upon seeing me started talking again about the man in black. Her eyes met mine when I asked, "Did he smile?" Her face grew serious, focused, and she whispered, "How do you know?" My heart, already racing, stopped. Lena screamed, "He's coming! Save me!" That night, I was transferred to another ward, but I couldn't stay until the end of the shift. The next day, I wrote to the head nurse, telling her that that night had been my last. I don't know if it was a dream or result of insomnia, but what I felt was real. A hand on my shoulder, a man smiling behind the glass. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I hope it never happens again. I can still remember that night like it was yesterday, the way the cold still lingers in the corners of my mind. Lena's words, all those unsettling things she said, seemed to creep inside me like a slow poison. But nothing could have prepared me for what I felt next. The hand on my shoulder, the grin of that man behind the glass door, exactly like the description the patient had given over and over. The whole thing, it didn't make sense, but it was happening. One of those rare, unexplainable encounters that you try to dismiss, but something deep inside tells you this is real. Something you'll never forget. At least I hoped it was a one-time thing. It was late. I just finished work and was heading home. Same old route. I clocked out around midnight, so it was probably closer to 1 a.m. now. My town, as usual, was eerily quiet. Just miles of woods and barely a soul around. The stretch of road near my house, with the cornfields on one side and the woods on the other, seemed to stretch endlessly. The night air was warm, midsummer heat pressing down, and the top of my convertible was down, the wind rushing through my hair as I coasted down the road at a steady 50 miles an hour. Then it happened. The scream, sharp, gut-wrenching. A woman's cry for help. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came from the left, from the woods. Without a second thought, I grabbed the baton from the back seat and jumped out of the car. "Who's out there?" I called. Immediately, the voice answered back. "Please, help me." I ran toward the sound, my footsteps crunching against the twigs and leaves. "Keep screaming," I shouted, hoping to find her, to reach her. Every 10 seconds, her voice would echo out, "Help!" And I'd race toward it. But something started to feel off. No matter how deep into the woods I ran, the cries didn't get any closer. They stayed the same distance, the same intensity. I stopped, breathless, realizing I'd been chasing shadows. The cries kept coming, but they didn't make any sense. They didn't change. "Where are you?" I yelled, fear beginning to creep in. Then the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't right. I turned around and sprinted back, not caring how fast I was going, just wanting to get out. As I neared the edge of the woods, I saw the headlights of my car through the trees, but the cries, they were still there, as if she were following me, stalking me. I threw myself into the car and sped away. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, still rattled, still confused. I reported it, just in case they wanted to look into it, but I wasn't sticking around. I was too freaked out. The next week, something on the news made my stomach turn. A woman's body had been found in those very woods, found by a hiker. No signs of foul play. The place they found her? Exactly where I had heard those screams. It was too much of a coincidence, too much to ignore. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been part of something I couldn't understand. A few weeks later, Jenny and I took a trip up to her family's cabin in Vermont. We'd been hanging out for a while, but this would be the first time we'd go snowboarding together. The drive up was long, about 5 hours, but we finally reached the winding, narrow roads of the mountains, and I could feel the isolation creeping in. The trees, the quiet, everything felt distant, as if we were the only two people in the world. I slowed down when she yelled, "It's coming up!" We turned onto a narrow trail, barely noticeable through the thick woods. After a few minutes, we pulled up to a small, snow-covered house. It looked like something out of a winter postcard. Cozy, inviting, just what we needed. We unloaded our things, turned on the heat, and settled in. That night, we didn't do much except cook dinner and watch a movie. But the quiet of that cabin, surrounded by endless snow and darkness, was enough to make me feel like something wasn't right. Something hung in the air, just out of reach. And I couldn't help but think, maybe, just maybe it wasn't over yet.